member here at Mixed Roots Stories and work specifically with student outreach. And I'm here today with Jenifer Logia, who was a board member for the University of California, Los Angeles Mixed Student Union, and has recently been recognized for starting the Alumni Association at UCLA. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that got started and how Mixed Student Union has affected her work now.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, so a question that we at Mixed Roots Stories like to ask on our podcast is just to get the story started, what is your Mixed Roots story?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I was born in San Francisco Bay Area. My mom is an immigrant from Nicaragua. She came to this country in the 80s. And my father was born here, but his parents came from the Philippines and Guam. So I grew up here in the Bay Area. I identify as a multiracial woman. I identify as Latina, Asian American, Pacific Islander, as a woman of color. And being multiracial is something that's been a big part of my identity for a long time. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. So being in the Bay Area, I just moved here a couple of years ago, but noticed that there's incredible diversity here, cultural, national, regional, and racial diversity. So how do you think that being here and growing up here affected your mixed race identity?
Yeah, well, like you said, there's a lot of diversity here in the Bay Area. I think growing up when I was younger, I kind of took that for granted because I hadn't really been anywhere else in the country where things are different. So this has always been the norm for me. A lot of my family are here in the Bay Area from my mom's side and from my dad's side. There's a large Latino population here. There's a large Asian American and Pacific Islander community here. And so I'd always seen those communities around me growing up. However, there wasn't really space or a community for folks who identify as multiracial, or was always talked about as either one thing or another, or you're half this, half that. And I didn't really find a community for people of multiracial backgrounds until college, until I moved to Los Angeles. So definitely grew up around diversity, but it is always talked about in more of a monoracial way.
Yeah, so that kind of gets to my question about high schoolers. Since I work so much with student groups, but most of the time it's not until college that really people start to talk about it.
Right.
So that wasn't ever part of your high school experience, or did people ever talk about that in your school?
Sometimes. It wasn't a huge part of it, but I definitely got asked questions about, what are you, or how did your parents meet, things like that. I have two sisters who are really close in age to me, and we look very different. A lot of people don't even really know that we're sisters until we mention it. Even though we all went to the same high school, so we kind of had some of that. But yeah, I think in high school, back then I would say I was a little bit more white passing, and kind of, I wasn't really sure where my place was back then, and so yeah, I didn't really start thinking about my identity in terms of race until probably about my senior year of high school. So even though I got questions here and there and I thought about it on occasion, it wasn't a big part of my high school experience.
What brought it up for you senior year?
So senior year, I went on this trip. It's called Sojourn to the Past. It's a trip for high school students to spend 10 days in the South, and we learn about the civil rights movement and social justice issues. And that was the first time for me that I really started to learn about racial inequality and the history of the civil rights movement in this country. So that experience really opened my eyes to starting to talk about race and social justice.
So that was when you said you started to have a mixed race identity. Did you feel like you had a multicultural identity before, or was one, how did your parents raise you, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, it's something that I get asked a lot. I think Fortunately for me, it was never really more one side or the other.
Mhm.
I really felt like growing up, both of my parents exposed me to each of their cultures really evenly. And so, I'd spend a lot of time with my mom's side of the family and my dad's side of the family, um, and took a trip to visit my mom's home country, Nicaragua, when I was 14 for the first time. And that was when I really started to learn a lot about that side of my family and where my mom comes from. But yeah, growing up, I've always been in a really multicultural setting. My dad is the youngest of 8, and all 7 of his brothers and sisters married outside of their race as well. So all of my cousins are mixed race, and growing up, Christmas, Thanksgiving, it was just such a blended, huge family of all different cultures. And yeah, growing up, before I really started to understand issues around race or just identity in general, I just kind of took that for granted as that was, my family, that was my lifestyle, and didn't really think much of it until started college.
I feel the train a-coming, I hear the whistle blowing loud, it's calling out my name, rumble in the ground, I swear it sounds a lot like